There is an SEC bias at work on the College Football Playoff Selection Committee, and we're going to talk about it after the bumper.
Don't be cornering me. Hold up. Time. You got to help me with that corner shit.
What's up, kinfolk? It's RJ Young. I'm not on a step mill. Consider hitting the like and subscribe button because I upload a video every single day. It's always OU related, college football related, sports related. We have a good time. Today, I want to talk about the SEC bias in college football and on the selection committee. But first, I want to encourage you, sign up for my newsletter. If you do so between now and December 7th, you get an opportunity to win the Hertz lamp. Looks like this. Just give me your garbage email account and get these exclusive columns, videos, and free stuff I'm sending you. So, be sure to check your account after December 7th. I'm also going to include a segment I did on Big 12 this morning about OU's offense and how OU, Baylor, and the Big 12 were portrayed in the College Football Playoff Selection Committee's rankings. But first, count the Big 10 teams in the playoff committee ranking. Even though the Big 10 boasts 2 of the 5 undefeated teams left in the FBS and is the only league to claim 2 in a Power 5 conference, just 1 ranks inside the top 5. 3 rank inside the top 10, and 6 of the league's 14 members rank inside the top 25. Now, look at it again. Count up the Big 12 teams. You'll see 5. That's 5 in a 10-team league, but the highest ranked is number 10 and isn't even the team that's undefeated. In fact, 4 Big 12 teams rank outside the top 10. Now, count the Pac-12. Both of them. Oregon and Utah, where the common opponent is 6-4 USC. Oregon beat the Trojans, Utah lost to them, and that's a 12-team league with just half the members owning a winning record. The Big 12 claims the same amount with 2 fewer teams in the league, but at least the Pac-12 has 2, which brings us to the ACC. Count the Atlantic Coast Conference teams. You can stop at number 3 Clemson. That's it. Even though the conference has 7 teams with winning records, half of its 14 members, and claims 5 teams with 3 losses or fewer through at least 9 games in what is widely viewed as the weakest Power 5 conference in football. This time, go and count the SEC teams. Write down each team's ranking. You'll see 2 SEC teams in the top 3, 3 in the top 5, 5 in the top 25. That's a 14-team league with 5 ranked teams, but with as many teams with winning records through week 12 as the perceived hapless ACC, and just 1 more team with 3 losses or fewer than Clemson and its 13 hangers-on. According to ESPN Stats and Info, LSU is the 4th different SEC school to top the college football playoff rankings. Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi State. Only 2 non-SEC schools have ever been number 1 in these rankings, Clemson and Ohio State. Ohio State has played better defense this year than NORAD and is operating like a level 5 kaiju. The Buckeyes lead the nations in point allowed, yards allowed, points scored per game, and has been as dominant as Cael Sanderson on a wrestling mat. Ohio State is number 1 in ESPN's FBI and 34.7 points better than the average or mediocre college football team in the FBS. ESPN's Brad Edwards found only 3 other teams in the 15 years since he's been doing this have been 33.6 points better than the average FBS team. 2005 Texas, 2005 USC, and 2013 Florida State. And only 05 USC, an all-timer, has been 34.5 points better than the FBS average squad, which means the Buckeyes could be the best advanced metrics team of all time come December and one of the best college football teams of all time, and yet they're number 2 in this ranking. That the Tide dropped from number 3 to number 5 means the Alabama Crimson Tide is outside the top 4 for the first time since November 28th, 2017. You'll also remember that is the year Tua Tagovailoa came off the bench to lead the Gumps to a national championship. You see how this is shaping up for 2 SEC teams to get in. Then there's Minnesota, making like a bad Coca-Cola product with surge. The Golden Gophers leaped from number 17 to number 8, which is the biggest jump that any team has made in the top 10 in the playoff rankings. The previous largest crossing of the playoff ranking chasm was 6 spots when Ohio State took the jump in 2014 and Oklahoma State made the leap in 2015. But Minnesota apparently doesn't mean much to the playoff committee because, well, we'll get to their criteria in just a second, how they're being hypocritical. The read here is the selection committee clearly believes the SEC has better teams at the top than the remaining 9 leagues in the FBS. They really just like one team from the Big Ten, don't expect the Big 12 to really compete for a 4 spot, and have only glanced in the direction of the Pac-12 with its ranking 2 of its members in the top 10. So is there an SEC bias? Hell yes, there is. But why? That's the question. Peep game. The Associated Press reported last week's LSU-Bama showdown was watched by 16.636 million folks. That's not only the most watched college football game all season, but the most highly rated regular season game on CBS in 8 years. The second most highly watched game this year, it wasn't OU Texas, but Georgia Notre Dame on CBS with 9.349 million flipping over to broadcast television to watch the Golden Domers hold this L. And for the SEC on CBS, this has been a banner year. Their best year of TV viewing since 1990, back when text messages were sent via carrier pigeon on ink and parchment. Now, I'm putting all this on tape and putting this in perspective with a little bit more data to help everyone really get a sense and understanding of how this selection committee process is biased toward the SEC, but also take into account the AP poll, which released preseason rankings this season that included 4-5 Nebraska ranked number 24, 5-4 Iowa State at number 21, 4-5 Michigan State at number 18, 3-6 Syracuse at number 22, 4-5 Wazoo at number 23, and 4-5 Stanford at number 25. So I'm saying that to say there are guidelines in place that say that the College Football Playoff Selection Committee members are required to discredit polls wherein initial rankings are established before a competition has occurred, like preseason rankings. Right. Okay. All right. Let's take the look at this. I'm going to read the list of the first 16 ranked teams in the AP Top 25 preseason poll, and you tell me which ones make it into their playoff selection ranking. Clemson, Alabama, Georgia, Oklahoma, Ohio State, LSU, Michigan, Florida, Notre Dame, Texas, Oregon, Washington, Utah, Penn State, and Auburn. Only one of these preseason top 16 teams isn't ranked in the committee's playoff poll, and that's 6-4 Washington. Now, peep the top 20 teams in the 2016 247 composite recruiting rankings, or the group of this year's collegiate seniors. Alabama, LSU, Florida State, Ohio State, Ole Miss, Georgia, Texas, Michigan, Auburn, USC, Clemson, Florida, UCLA, Tennessee, Notre Dame, Stanford, Michigan State, Texas A&M, Oklahoma, and Penn State. Add to this, South Carolina checks in at number 25, Nebraska checks in at number 26, Oregon at 27, and Washington at number 29. So that's 7 SEC teams in the top 16 and 8 of the top 20 and 9 of the top 25 in the recruiting rankings for 2016. Now add to this a mass of humanity drafted into the NFL out of the Southeastern Conference. The SEC has the most draft picks of any conference for the last 13 years in a row. There are only 224 selections each year. In 2019, 64 of them were from SEC schools. Texas A&M had 7 picks, Ole Miss had 6, and Kentucky, a basketball school, had 5. Alabama alone had 10 drafted and 3 in the first round, which means Nick Saban has more players drafted in the first round of the NFL than any other coach in the history of the sport. Now, for perspective, the Big 12 had just 26 players drafted in 2019, and 8 of them came from one school. That would be the University of Oklahoma. You see where I'm going with all of this, right? You see how all of this is working together to create a critical mass. Yes, the committee is biased toward the SEC. So are the voters, and so are we. We let the recruiting rankings, a number next to a team's name, and the NFL draft process influence our TV watching. So we expect the SEC to be the best. It's no shock the committee does too. They value LSU beating 4 ranked teams above all else. Quality wins is their heaviest metric. And I hate that they discount the toughest task in the sport to accomplish, which is running the table undefeated. Bring me a 16-team playoff on winged feet, and we'll probably end up with half the SEC in it, which is no less than we deserve. All right, now let's go talk to Ari.
I'm Ari Champion, along with Dave Archer, the former Iowa State Cyclones and Atlanta Falcons quarterback. Talk now with front program RJ Young, host of the RJ Young Show on the Tulsa Sports Animal 97.1 in Tulsa, also part of the OU 24/7 network, and of course you can catch him on YouTube as well. RJ Young. RJ, good morning. How are you, sir?
Hey, Ari, how you doing, brother?
Doing well, man. Thank you.
Man.
All right, we were just going to talk about OU's offense and what are they at, 9.29 yards per play? Is that what it is this year?
Yeah, it's something gaudy like that, but you wouldn't know it from looking at what Oklahoma fans have been, incensed about, which is one, the loss to K-State, and then needing to stop a 2-point conversion against Iowa State. So the stats are the stats, and we're all, awed by them, and I think they look good on paper. But the question around town has been, is Lincoln Riley forgot that there's some tailbacks back there, and now he's down one, right? So that's what's been interesting, because the offense is Jalen Hurts in the same way that, the Rockets offense is James Harden, and that's not necessarily a good thing. So there's some angst in Norman this time of year.
Let me ask you, so of the OU offenses the past 3 seasons, how would you rank them, 1, 2, and 3? Which would be the best and which would be the worst of the 3?
Oh, that's a really good question, man. I really love that 2017 offense, that one that played in the Rose Bowl against Georgia. I also thought that offense matched up the best with the eventual national champion in Alabama. You just had to get through what I thought was the best defense in all of college football in Georgia, and they weren't able to do that even with a 17-point lead. That offense last year, as much as we talk about Kyler Murray, it was much more about the distribution to the wide receivers and that awesome offensive line. I mean, that's the best offensive line I've ever seen, and the NFL draft said so as well. This one I would rank actually third. So that 2017 team would be 1, 18 would be 2, and this one would be 3, because as good as guys like CeeDee Lamb have been and Charleston Rambo have been, you've seen musical chairs on the offensive line. We'll see what happens with the right tackle and Adrian Ely, who went down with an injury against Iowa State. They have a bunch of brand new starters on that line. Creed Humphrey hasn't looked like the guy we saw last year, but he's also having to carry that line in a different way. And quite frankly, you just haven't got the same production from the running backs, which is ridiculous, because when they get the ball put in their bellies, they average more yardage per carry than Jalen Hurts does, and he averaged 7 yards per carry. So it's difficult to pin down what's going on with it while it still produces a ton of yards and a ton of points.
RJ, would you describe the second half, or maybe even more the fourth quarter, as a John Haycock adjustment where he limited Oklahoma and Iowa State was able to possess the football? Or was it more Oklahoma up 21 points and something we don't normally see from Lincoln Riley, that they took their foot off the accelerator? How would you describe what happened in the fourth quarter?
I would really talk in terms of what Jalen Hurts was doing and what the offense was doing, and then what Breece Hall was doing on the Iowa State offense. Because as good as Haycock and that defense was playing, they were putting people on the ground. They gave up a lot of points, but they also held Oklahoma scoreless in that fourth quarter, and I get where you're going with that. But if you don't get a late pick from Jalen Hurts with 3:35 left to go, egregious on your half of the football field, where you can run out the clock and punt the ball away, you don't really have this conversation about whether or not the defense was better than the offense. And I want to really tip my hat to Matt Campbell and Tom Manning, because they got a true freshman tailback to get in some work against this defense that had been really good against Texas and just hasn't been since the West Virginia game. So I think it's, as people say, and it's not, I hate this because it's a cop-out, but it's a bit of both, right? In that Mike Rose was playing outstanding. Greg Ainsworth just dropped a couple that Jalen Hurts tried to throw him. It was a really, really crappy game for Hurts, even as he passed for 18 of 26 for 273. And I guess that means that it was a really good game for their secondary in particular, because they got what they wanted on the ground. Oklahoma did. They just weren't able to. Lincoln Riley said he just went away from what was working, which was, hey, man, if you're going to give us a box with 5 guys in it, don't you run it that, Dave? And they just didn't. I couldn't figure out why.
Yeah, and it almost felt like there was, and I don't think I've ever seen an OU team do this. And believe me, I'm sitting there watching it, and my team's down 21 points. And I said, well, they're gonna throttle a pretty good Iowa State team,
Mm-hmm.
and then all of a sudden it just looked like OU kind of lost their stinger all of a sudden, and then maybe the stinger was the ability to run the football with those backs and Jalen Hurts, but. It was just a strange fourth quarter for OU that I hadn't really seen them perform like that in recent years.
The sports radio take on this is, can we trust Lincoln Riley with a lead? Because it hadn't gone well in a couple of games in particular, right? This one, and then people, the Rose Bowl is kind of I'm the only person that brings it up here, and people tell me not to all the time. But I mean, it was weird, and that's the only way to put it. But also, Dave, your team doesn't get blown out. That ain't what they do, right? They're gonna fight. They're gonna find a way. Matt Campbell really wanted this win, man. He's stabbing himself with the pin on the sideline. That was great to see after CeeDee Lamb had just basically made that defense look silly, and I don't blame him. But man, I felt like they could have won that game and should have won that game, because you'll notice, like I noticed, two things. Parnell Motley with the pass interference on his pick, and yo, man, there's a tight end wide open over there, Brock. You just got to toss him the ball, dude.
Yep. RJ, what was your reaction to the college football playoff committee rankings last night?
That their criteria is not really the criteria that they put in on paper, right? Things like we're not supposed to take into account preseason rankings and what teams are ranked before we see them, yada, yada, yada. But they value who did you play and was there a number next to their name. That's what they value. And that's the only way that you can rank Baylor at 13. You're going to ding them for their non-conference schedule, but you're also not going to give them credit for teams that you ranked because they weren't ranked at the time that they played them. And I think that that's silly, and I think it's stupid. I think that zeros are worth more than ones and twos, but I'm also not on that committee, and I think that it's the most difficult thing in this sport to go undefeated throughout an entire season, let alone get to 9-0, and we got two 9-0 teams that rank outside the top 5 with only 5 undefeated teams left in the sport, and I find that asinine. I think Baylor's getting robbed, man. They're getting jobbed on this thing.
Well, it almost seems like they're talking on both sides of their mouth, RJ, they obviously value the Big 12 because you get half the constituencies is ranked, right? Mm-hmm. Half the teams are ranked. And I think a lot of people have a high regard for Iowa State. Obviously, what they did last weekend, they're not ranked, but you'd say 6 teams probably could beat anybody in the top 10, yet they don't value them enough to give Oklahoma and Baylor the credit. Now, Baylor and Oklahoma maybe I certainly think they deserve the credit, but they don't seem to get any credit. So they're talking about the depth of the conference, yet they're not getting benefit of the depth of the conference where their top 2 teams are ranked in the top 10.
And more than that, they want to act like Vanderbilt did score a lot of points on an LSU team, and they want to act like Ole Miss and Vandy don't count in this particular instance, and the same thing with Kansas State beating up on Mississippi State, but apparently they value that win for whatever reason. I've said this before, and I'll continue to say it. There is an SEC bias on that committee, but there's a SEC bias among all of us that claim to be college football fans. The most watched game of the season, LSU, Bama. The second most watched, Notre Dame, Georgia. You're looking at who's getting drafted. They had 64 guys drafted out of the SEC last year. I mean, Nick Saban has more first-round selections than any other coach in football. When you look at them, you compare what they have on the roster to the 2016 recruiting rankings, you'll find 9 teams in the top 25 of the rankings. So, I mean, I think we're all feeding into it, and we're doing that thing where we don't really want to value the teams that play on the field. And yet still, Appalachian State can't really get ranked after they lose a game to Georgia Southern. But if they beat a South Carolina team that beat a Georgia team but also got beat down by Alabama, all of a sudden it means something. I get the talking out of both sides of their mouth, but this is just what it's going to be. I mean, I want a 16-team playoff, and we're probably going to get 8 SEC teams in there because that's how people view that conference.
Yeah, you're right. RJ, what do you make of the game Saturday in Waco? It should be a fun one, and it's the game of the century of the week in the Big 12.
No, that's a good way to put it, Ari. I really want this one to go into the final minutes of whatever it might be, whether it be overtime or regulation, because that's the kind of game that Baylor apparently lives for. And while I get Oklahoma being a 2-score favorite in this thing, I don't see it because Baylor's just been able to figure out who you are defensively and then try to attack that. And then Charlie Brewer, for me, is the best pro prospect at quarterback playing football in this conference right now. So if they're open, he's going to find them. And there's a lot of the guys on that offense that just aren't name brands. And Denzel Mims feels like he's been on, just 7th-year senior over there. But I think it's going to be really close, and I think Oklahoma's going to get tested, and I hope that the committee will take into account that both of these teams are really good, that they rank that Kansas State team that beat Oklahoma off of that win, that Oklahoma State is still ahead, and they think that they're good. And if Baylor gets the W, put them in this top 5, man. But then again, Penn State beats a team they ranked number 4 and was undefeated. They can't get in the top 5. Whatever.
RJ Young.
Yeah, real quickly, RJ, do you see, you just mentioned an SEC bias. This is certainly pointing towards two SEC teams getting in, a Big Ten champion, and probably Clemson is not going anywhere because they're not going to play anybody that's going to be able to threaten them. So it leaves the Pac-12 out again, and this time it looks like it leaves the Big 12 out. Is that the way you see it?
Yeah, well, that's interesting, right? Because if Georgia goes and gets that W against LSU, you could end up with two teams in, right? But Oklahoma, according to the criteria set out by the committee, would have ranked wins against Baylor, against Oklahoma State, and presumably Baylor again, or another ranked opponent in the Big 12 title game. And the winner of that Pac-12 championship would only have two, and that's assuming that one beats the other, right? And then you're looking around at the Big 10, and I'm rooting for carnage, Dave. I want Minnesota to run the table. I want them to beat Ohio State. So now you're left with a really good Ohio State team that has a loss, and then let Georgia beat LSU. And then tell me what you're going to do with all of that, right? Because you're going to leave somebody out, and you could end up with two Big Ten teams and two SEC teams, and then people are really going to be at your throat. Because that's the only way we're going to actually get past this thing, is to blow it up once again.
Yeah, you're right. That's a good call.
RJ Young, catch him on the Tulsa Sports Channel, 97.1 from 9 a.m. to 11 a.m. Also, OU 24/7, and make sure to subscribe to his YouTube page. That's great video, not just on OU, but on all of college football and all of sports. RJ, you're the man. Appreciate your time, buddy. Be well.
Thank you, Ari. I appreciate you. Thanks, Dave.
Thanks, RJ. Appreciate you.
RJ Young joining us here, Big 12 this morning, Sirius XM, channel